Alright, so now we're on to Parmenides' argument that there is no real change, that change is an illusion. And so just to jog your memory, although it should still be pretty fresh, Parmenides thought that the previous philosophers' views, the Milesian naturalists' views, were incorrect because they all required the elements or the boundless to change from one thing into another. So things had to go out of existence and come into existence, and that's change. And so Parmenides thought there is no change. This is the argument as to why he thought that. So first, he just assumes that's X, which is just some object, right? He assumes that some object has come into existence. And he's assuming this because this is just the view of the Milesian naturalist, right? This is the view of his opponents. His opponents believe that things can come into or go out of existence. So his plan is to assume the view that his opponents hold, show that it leads to an absurdity, and if their view is absurd, then it must be incorrect, and the opposite must be true. So that's the general structure of this argument. Assume their view, show that it's absurd, leads to a contradiction, conclude that the opposite must be true. Okay, so he assumes X has come into existence. Then Parmenides says, well, if X has come into existence, then it follows that it is not, this phrase, it is not, is true of X before it came into existence. What does that mean? Take a minute to think about that for yourself. It follows that it is not is true of that object before it came to exist. We'll explain that a little bit deeper in a second, but hopefully you're already starting to come up with some ideas as to what that might mean. Alright, so if 1 and 2 are true, then Parmenides says that's absurd. Right? It is not can never be true of any object. Because if it were true of some object, then you would have something that could both exist and be nothing at the same time. And that's absurd, right? That would be a contradiction. This thing exists and also doesn't exist. This thing is nothing. How can something exist and be nothing at the same time? It can't. So, the initial view must be absurd. Thus, nothing comes into existence, or there's no change. So that's just a different way of saying number 4, right? Nothing comes into existence, or there is no change in reality. So, hopefully you're feeling pretty comfortable so far. I know this is a weird argument, so if you're struggling, don't worry. We're hopefully going to get clear as we move on here. But just notice already that the key phrase that Parmenides is using to get his argument to work is this, it is not. So we really need to understand what he means by it is not if we're going to make sense of this argument. Because if this argument is correct, remember, if we're taking reason over experience, then we should believe Parmenides' conclusion that there is no real change in the world, that nothing comes into existence. So you or I, no one came into existence. So if we want to get out of this conclusion, we have to show where his argument is flawed. Okay, so part of the key to understanding this it is not phrase is to think about what else it could mean. So it is not not translates, but can also be read as previously X did not exist. Right? So that's what he means by it is not. And so X has come into existence. It follows that previously X did not exist. That seems right to all of us, right? So if you came into existence, there was a point in time before that where you didn't exist. If that's our reading, though, and that's what we're saying Parmenides thought, then why are we getting this absurdity? Because that just seems to follow, right? Something came into existence. Before it came into existence, it didn't exist. But that's not absurd. So Parmenides must be using a strange reading of the phrase previously it did not exist, or it is not. And here we get part 2. Alright, so this phrase, it is not, or previously, it did not exist. Write that in there, although it might be too small for you to see. Can be read in 2 different ways. And the first is that in the past, X, or some object, remember we're going to use X to just refer to any object. In the past, X had the property of not existing. Take a minute, think about what that might mean. In the past, some object, X, had the property of not existing. It actually had the property at some point in the past. Okay, or it could mean that X is just not included in the set of things which existed in the past. Think about what this means for yourself for a second. Whenever I say that, I suggest you pause to take some time to think for yourself. So X is not included in the set of things which existed in the past. So now, which of these do you think is the proper interpretation of the phrase, it is not, or previously it did not exist? 2 seems to be the common usage, right? So what we're saying here in number 2 is just that there are all the things that exist, right? So let's say here's this set. And in this set, there's all the things that exist. And now we think about all the things that existed at some past moment. And what we're saying is these things, so these things over here that we know currently exist are in the set of currently existing things are not in this set, right? It's not one gigantic set. Really what we have are 2 separate things. The set of things that exist and the set of things that existed in the past. And X, our object that we're talking about, is in this set, and it's not in this set. It didn't exist in this past. That's a really complicated way of getting at our common sense notion, right? So we think that before we came into existence, we just weren't included in the set of things. That's fine. So this puts it in a little bit more complicated terms than we'd normally like, but it makes a lot of sense of our common sense notion that just we didn't exist then we popped into existence. Now okay, so here's the very important part. This interpretation, our common sense interpretation, does not lead to an absurdity. Right? So to go back really quick, if we put our common sense notion in here for it is not, well then we don't get this absurdity because whatever object we're talking about isn't both existent and nothing at the same time. It's existent at one point in time, it's non-existent at another point in time, but it never actually holds both of those properties at the same time. And that's what Parmenides needs to get his absurdity, right? The object has to have both the properties of existence and non-existence at the same time. But with interpretation 2, we don't get that absurdity. So that's good, right? With our common sense notion, we're able to avoid the absurdity. So now let's look at interpretation 1, which has to be closer to what Parmenides actually meant. Because 1 will allow us to generate that absurdity in Parmenides' original argument. So interpretation 1 says, in the past, X had the property of not existing. Right? So imagine a timeline. What number 1 is saying is that here is when we think X came into existence, right? And X somehow held the property of non-existence here. So X actually held property 1 here. And then now, at all these future moments, it holds property 2. And so now it holds the property of existing. In the past, it held the property of not existing, or being nothing. So what Parmenides is saying is this object is somehow able to cling on and have this past property. Right? So even though we think this is where X really started, there must be something more to it. X was around here to have the property of non-existence, and X is around now to have the property of existence. And so X can have both properties at the same time, and that's where we get our contradiction. But luckily for us, right, it seems like 2 is the much more plausible interpretation. So 1 will give us the absurdity because previously it did not exist, will lead to this absurdity on interpretation 1, because then an object can have both of these properties at the same time, existence and being nothing. But on interpretation 2, the and actually becomes an or, right? So it either existed, or is existing, or was nothing. But that's just normal. That's what we already think. Good. So now you've seen the 2 possible interpretations, and how you get out of Parmenides' argument is to say, well, 1 is just a bad interpretation, right? Not only does it lead us into absurdity, but there's a much more plausible interpretation in interpretation 2, and 2 does not lead to that same absurdity. So I know this is a pretty complicated argument. If you are lost or struggling to understand it, feel free to go to the discussion board, try and talk through it with your classmates. Feel free to email me and ask me further questions. If you still don't understand it, don't worry too much. The quizzes and the midterm are more so going to ask you about what Parmenides, what his place in the conversation was with the rest of the pre-Socratics. So it's really important for you to know that Parmenides thought that reason was more important than experience, and that the previous philosophers were all incorrect because there's no real change in the world, and their views required change. If you can also understand this, that's fantastic. This is a complicated argument, but if you start to get a grasp on this, it'll be easier for you to understand a lot of arguments coming in the future. Okay, so that's it. That's why Parmenides thought there was no real change, but we can prove he was mistaken. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.